Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 2 of the Garot Podcast. I am Chingachgook, and today I am joined by my co-host, Howard Roark.
Greetings.
So, sort of in keeping with what I was saying in episode 1, as we go through these episodes, each one of these episodes is going to be used to focus on a particular concept. And the idea that I was talking about in episode 1 was that each one of these concepts were comparable to a tool being in a toolkit. It's kind of funny, one of the things that you were saying just before we got started was the exercise that you and I would be having to engage in being characterized by a process in which we have to purposely avoid the shorthand terms that you and I frequently use in our discussions for the sake of being able to bring the audience along and allow for the generic third party to understand what it is that we're talking about.
And expect them to understand what we're talking about.
Correct. And sort of when you were pointing that out, an image came to my mind of a YouTube channel that I kind of like to follow. It's called Primitive Technology, where the idea is that there's this guy and the entire concept behind his content is that he takes a GoPro out with him to the middle of the woods. And he does sort of this wilderness survival type of videos where he builds his hut, he builds his fire, basically without any tools. He's basically out in the middle of the woods with shorts, a pair of sneakers, and a GoPro. And his fires are made completely from either rubbing sticks together or finding rocks that he can spark. But the entire concept behind his content is that he removes away all of what modern outdoorsmen would consider vital tools to engage in wilderness survival and say, all right, you get none of that. You just have to go from the ground up. That's sort of the image that I got when you were describing what it was that we could expect, particularly for certainly the first formal episode of the podcast where you're here in studio with me.
Limitations of the technology, except for the GoPro. The GoPro would be the microphones, I suppose.
Right.
And
the mechanism by which the process is captured.
Right. Our conversation is wrought with self-imposed limitations.
So it'll be interesting. But from such limitations, hopefully, copious creativity will arise. So that being said, one of the, if not the key term that you and I throw around in the context of our discussions of really anything is the term meta. Now, this is sort of interesting because I actually have a little bit of a story to tell about this term. When you and I started using the term meta more and more consistently as a tool to delve into whatever topic that we would be addressing at the time, I found myself actually trying to bring the term out to third parties, to conversations outside of the context of what you and I would discuss. And this is a process that dates back, at least 3 years minimum ago by now, where I've tried to use the term meta with other people. And I found myself in a very peculiar situation because, particularly with individuals who are comparable to our age, maybe even a bit younger, basically any internet savvy generation, I would probably exclude the baby boomers from this. Whenever I would use the term meta, they would look at me and say, oh yeah, I know what that is. But then very quickly, as my conversation with them would progress, they would demonstrate very clearly that
they did not.
Well, either A, they did not. They had a very hazy understanding of the term meta, and they were just saying that they understood it just to progress the conversation. Or B, and this is actually more important, they were attaching a definition to the term that was functionally completely divorced from the way you and I were using and understanding the term. So I think this was about, again, this is a while back, but I remember there was an episode from Rick and Morty it had to have been one of the later seasons. It was the season where there was a noticeable drop in the quality of the storytelling, of the narrative telling. It was the episode of Rick and Morty where they were on the train. it was like a toy train. It's called like narrative train. They're going round and round. And then it ends with Rick and Morty basically converting to Christianity and declaring their love for Jesus Christ at the end of the episode to the despair of the villain. It was a very bizarre episode. But one of the things that Rick kept saying was, "Oh my gosh, that's so meta, Morty. That's so meta." That was a very interesting episode for me to watch in particular because the way Rick was using meta in that episode, although it is completely broken from the perspective of the way you and I utilize the term, it was very reminiscent of the way other people use the term. It was this weird amorphous adjective to describe a sort of breaking of some kind of fourth wall. I don't know. I don't think it's worth our time to try to unpack the way the generic individual or even Rick Sanchez understands the term meta. But all that to say is there exists an understanding of the term meta out in common parlance, in common use, apparently, that is wholly divorced from the way we understand it. And what I want to do in this episode is to try to propose a definition of the way meta ought to be understood, the way meta ought to be defined, if you will, in a very succinct definition, so that with that definition, with that term, it then unlocks many doors when you use it as a tool of analysis for really any other set of questions, any other set of inquiry.
It's still helpful to look at something like the Rick and Morty episode, because what you can derive from that is a loose sense of the way that that episode still operates under some kind of a definition. So if you're going to say that that episode, which I don't think that episode is worth really discussing at the level of meta that we're trying to define here, because
Not at all.
my question would be, given that you've encountered the term elsewhere and it's used in a way that's different than the way that we would use the term, for example, that's just to say that these terms have different definitions. So what is the definition of the term as you've encountered it elsewhere? Or is that just unclear?
Well, at the central thrust of what I was saying in my story, it's fundamentally unclear.
Okay.
If you were to ask me, what is the definition that other people seem to be ascribing to the term meta, I'm really not sure.
So my follow-up to that, because I've seen the same, where the term is used by someone that generally doesn't understand what it is that they're talking about. When someone discusses and uses that term, there is some crossover on a Venn diagram for the term as it ought to be used and the term as it is seen and as we've observed. So what I'm wondering, I suppose, is where the crossover things lie. But if we're not going in that direction, then we can go in the direction of simply trying to define the term as we would use it. Is that more productive?
I think so. I think for the time being, it's sufficient to say that, and you can chime in as well, but on the basis of what I have casually observed in the past, other people use the term meta as an adjective to describe some kind of fourth wall breaking process. So, usually used in the context of some kind of show, play, story, something, and then the character suddenly turns and starts addressing the audience directly. Like, oh gosh, that's so meta.
Kind of. I've seen the term deployed in that way. Usually, I would even layer onto that there's an identification of a formula.
Mm.
So there's a combination of the identification of a formula and some kind of exercise in self-referential coherency. That seems to be the direction that people kind of poke at, but the problem is they don't use the term with the weight that it deserves.
Mm-hmm.
So
very much so.
If you don't understand the weight of the term, then you're not using the term in the context of where it needs to be used. Or that might even simply be to say that you're using the term inappropriately in the first place. So you're using the term in such a way where it deserves more weight than you're giving it, or you're using the term when you shouldn't be using the term because another term actually applies. That's a better description. So meta as we refer to it.
Right. So I actually have another story that can kind of ease us into this direction.
Okay.
So my understanding of meta as a concept actually predates the usage of meta as a term, particularly in the context of our dialogues and our discussions over the years. Back when I was in college, I was taking a philosophy class, and one of the things that the professor of that class at the time was describing to us on that one particular afternoon was this concept of why it is that philosophy seems to fixate on such obscure questions and particulars. And I remember this very clearly because he drew a diagram on the chalkboard that was really my introduction or my first encapsulation of what the term meta would mean. So what he did was he drew two vertical lines on the chalkboard. And then on the right line, he drew a dot toward the top of the line and then another dot toward the bottom of the line. And then he went to the left line and put two more points that were right next to each other, so close that they were basically almost the same dot. And then he drew lines between each one of these dots, so it basically looked like a triangle on its side in between these two lines. So you have the point of the triangle on the left line, and then it's spread out to its base on the other line. And what the professor was describing was a situation where on this left line, you have these 2 points that are very close and are different only in the minutest of details. But then what happens is that as logic progresses, as the arguments progress, or just as the process progresses, if you will, the abstracted process, these 2 points then depart so that when you go to what are quote unquote the surface level issues, you have these 2 points that have completely diverged from each other. And so the idea of meta then would be that which stands, that which functions behind what the generic individual would identify as quote unquote the bottom line or the surface. Or, oh, that's just this question and that's just that question. These are two independent questions, and you can have an opinion about question A, and you can have another opinion about question B, and it doesn't really matter that you correlate them. Well, it doesn't really work because, as we're going to talk about later on in the season, you have things like entailed statements. So, for the longest time, my own internalized definition of the term meta was a picture. It was a chart. It wasn't a definition that existed in words and terms. It was just something that I understood to be very clearly represented by that chart on the chalkboard. And so I remember one time trying to explain the term meta to somebody who was completely unfamiliar with the term. So it was a complete blank slate in that situation. And I didn't really have a very good example or definition in my back pocket to just pull out. And so it was very difficult for me to navigate through that conversation. But the way I kind of muddled through it at the time was that I pulled out the example of the abortion debate, particularly as it exists in the United States, where you have these two very polarized camps. And on one side, you say the right to an abortion is solely a woman's choice, and that's solely her prerogative of whether or not she wants to keep the child or abort the child. And then you have this other camp that says abortion is tantamount to murder, the murder of a child, no less, and that it is morally wrong. And you have these two sides that are talking past each other. And in the context of that conversation, what I improvisationally reached for at the time was trying to demonstrate that the question that is going unacknowledged in that debate is the question of whether or not it is the state's responsibility to legislate that which is moral versus immoral. Because at that point, until you establish that, you have this situation where somebody can say, yes, this is morally wrong. However, this is not within the prerogative of the state to legislate upon. Now, what I want to submit to you, Howard, is there a better example? Is that example faulty? Because I'm just recounting a previous conversation that I had and had very haphazardly at that. what would be a better example, and from either this example or an alternative example, what could possibly be the definition, the very concrete definition that we could then pull out of that would then fit into any variety of examples of the term meta.
All right. I'm going to give it a try. Your example is very easy to draw to the triangle chart that you were talking about. And the triangle chart, I would say, has something to do with the definition of meta in part. So I think that what I want to do is I want to talk around this a little bit before I can really put my finger on the definition, because there are two problems with trying to define the term meta, which might be why it's so difficult to define in the first place.
I'm listening.
The first thing is we have to deal with the self-referential coherency question of what's the meta of meta. And that's really difficult.
Hang on, let me write that down. What is the meta of meta?
Well, right, but it has to loop into itself, and that's part of the point.
Okay.
The second part is, within this definition, and something that's not acknowledged within the triangle example, is the opposite of meta, which is tangibility. So, in the case of directions, defining meta goes very high or very low in its kind of imagery. A lot of times, the meta structure, as it exists, can be defined as something that operates and pulls the strings of everything together. So something that is interesting about the direction going up or the direction going down, in terms of the definition of the term meta, is that either way, there's an acknowledgement of connections that are being made that otherwise wouldn't be made. So I would say, with the triangle example, that basically, if you're not going in the upwards direction, then you're going in the downwards direction, where you're trying to get underneath something.
Just to clarify, when you're using these terms upwards and downwards, you're referring to the same process, right? Basically, the idea of getting underneath something or something being so elevated that it's far away. I'm just trying to make sure that you're using upwards and downwards to represent the same thing, or are you using these terms to identify different things? Because whether you're going down or whether you're going up, correct me if I'm mistaken, but what you're getting at is the idea of that which is proximal versus that which is distal. Because the very quote-unquote surface level, the very, what's the bottom line, that's something that's extremely proximal. Oh, what's your opinion on A? What's your opinion on B? There's this idea that these things are right in front of your face, but then when you start getting into ideas of meta, when you're talking about the functions of the mechanism behind the questions behind the question, then that would be distal. That's something farther away. But you have to get to the stuff that's farther away in order to have a coherent grasp on anything that is proximal. And so what I'm just trying to make sure is, when you're saying upwards, you're saying downwards, that this is what you're referring to.
When I'm saying upwards or downwards, I am referring to the same metaphorical reference, but it's not proximity that I'm identifying with the upwards and the downwards. Because proximal versus distal, that makes me think of more of an x-axis in terms of time. So the immediate versus intermediate versus distal future. And that is a layer, but it's not the layer that we're talking about. It's easier for me to start with the downward direction, because this is a reference to, for example, the tectonic plates shifting.
The allegory of the tectonic plates.
Sure. The allegory of the tectonic plates, where very large pieces are moving in such a way where these individual pieces are carrying a lot on top of them. And it's moving everything that rests on top of it. But it's not the only plate. There are other things that are independent, that also carry a lot on top of them. And these plates interact with each other. When you're looking at the meta of an idea, you're trying to get underneath that idea so that you can carry it with all the rest of your ideas.
If we were to translate this back out of the allegory, those tectonic plates, those things behind the ideas, would be axioms, would be principles. Because each one of these axioms, each one of these principles carry with it a wide variety of implications and conclusions that then become the quote-unquote surface level ideas.
Well, right, but as you dig deeper, There are basically things that reach a level of depth that connect all of these things together. So that's one way to acknowledge meta in the context of depth, where you reach a level of depth so that these ideas are not freestanding in the sense that they can be coordinated, if not even combined. And then, once you acknowledge the area of that connection, everything underneath it qualifies. So you can predict where things are going to go. Everything that's being carried on this plate moves together. So that's one way that I would want to talk around that. Another way that I can talk around that is in the upward direction. And in the upward direction, there are two opposite questions at hand all the time. And understanding which direction you're going in terms of these two questions to try and understand something more, it's important to understand what direction you're going. So what I mean by that is that there are the two questions, and the two opposing questions are how and why. Those are opposite questions. Despite the fact that people tend to use them interchangeably, they're not interchangeable questions. Why goes in the direction of meta, and how goes in the direction of tangibility. So when something is tangible, then that means you know what to do in the world in front of you. You have a way to make a decision. You know what to do in the world.
So in this sense, tangible would be a noun or would be an adjective? Particularly in the context of our conversations, tangible is usually used as an adjective to describe a thing. It's a property that a thing can have. So something is tangible or something is intangible.
Okay.
So when something is intangible, that is to describe usually an idea, a concept, a claim. If a claim is intangible, there is something lacking with that claim. There is something flawed with that claim. There is something that discredits that claim because it lacks this property of tangibility.
Well, of course there's something that discredits that claim because there's no way to actually do it.
Do you have an example off the top of your head?
Are you asking for an example of something that is tangible?
Either or. A claim that has the property of tangible, or a statement that does not have the property of tangible, or a statement that has the property of intangible.
Such as, I want water, or I know how to drink water.
You're citing that as a tangible claim versus intangible claim.
Well, the tangible claim would be, I know how to drink water, but that would be intangible when you say, show me, and I don't know what to do.
So an example of an intangible claim that I sort of just generated on the spot right here would be, all you need to do to have financial success is to believe in yourself.
I thought you were going to do that.
So this is a claim that is a descriptive claim. In order to have financial success, all you need to do is believe in yourself. Okay, this is a statement that has the property of intangibility because, Howard?
Well, how do you do that is the question.
And there's no follow-up.
There's no answer to that question. There's no description. So when you don't know what to do, then there's a process to figure out what to do next. And sometimes, inherent to the problem, that process is compromised. But sometimes it's not.
Elaborate, what do you mean by that?
It's not the responsibility of someone listening to believe in yourself to figure out how to do that. It's the responsibility of the person who is saying you need to believe in yourself to say, this is how you do it if you don't know how.
And also, presumably, this is how doing that will lead to financial success in the context of this claim.
Sure, but that's part two. Part two is if it even works at all. Part one is, what does that mean for the decisions that are right in front of me? What does that mean for the question of what do you do next? What's exactly the next thing that you're going to do? That's a question that everyone should always know the answer to at all times.
Regardless of question, regardless of subject matter.
Regardless of question?
Yeah.
So that was a meta claim. That was a thumb up claim.
Oh, I see. Okay, so let's unpack that. Let's play with this a little bit.
Okay.
Because what we just did, we just introduced a new term. So thumb up and thumb down is a term that you and I use a lot and very instinctually now. And so it's going to be very interesting trying to...
I reverted to the shorthand.
It's very interesting
I had
to undo the shorthand and actually rebuild the shorthand back in. So, but hey, if the camping guy can do this, we can do this. All right, so now
I tried.
So now what we're doing is we're trying to simultaneously define at a bare minimum 2 terms. We have meta, and then we also have the adjective tangible. Tangibility would be the noun form.
Right.
So one of the things that you've said in the past, because this is not the first time that I've poked your brain about this, but one of the things that you said in the past that I like is tangible as an adjective describes a condition or describes a situation in which too much detail can be provided.
Correct. So if I were to elaborate upon that, essentially it also builds upon the thing that I was describing earlier when I was talking about why versus how.
Hmm.
So when I say that tangibility goes in the direction of the question how, you can ask how you do something. So how do you do that? And that question should break down into smaller parts that are understandable, that are comprehensible. And you can look at any of those individual parts and say, how do you do that? And then that will break down into smaller comprehensible parts. And you can look at any of those parts and say, how do you do that? And this process can repeat itself to the point where the details are absurd. You don't need that many details anymore. And that's when you've achieved tangibility. If you cannot go through that process of making something ridiculously obvious by always providing enough detail for how to do something, then you can't expect anyone to do what you're telling them.
So let's put an example on that for the sake of greater illustrative strength. Let's pull like a piano example. So if a student says to you, I cannot play a C major arpeggio, and then the idea, and particularly the reason why the term tangible is so powerful, is because it becomes a very powerful tool to analyze whether or not solutions provided are adequate. Because a lot of times instructions, commands come in the form of solutions. Oh, well, all you have to do is X. So, in the situation where you have a student who proclaims, I cannot perform a C major arpeggio, how would the generic piano instructor in that instance provide an answer that passes the tangibility test, that possesses this attribute of tangible?
All right.
In the context that you're describing as breaking things into smaller and smaller constituent
Well, that's
parts.
fine. And this is a reasonable example, I suppose, of something to put into the how versus why architecture. So I don't know how to play a C major arpeggio. So there's a hidden premise in there, which is you know why you're doing it in the first place. There's a point, even if that's to figure out what your instructor is going to say next. There's a reason for why you are going to pursue the question of how to play the C major arpeggio. So if we just grant for now that there's a reason to do this in the first place, because there's something that it leads to afterwards, and that is a very important process. That's why you would go in the why direction, as I continue to try to get a grip on the self-referential coherency of this. There could be a question for what needs to be subdivided in order to understand the C major arpeggio. So you can subdivide that into saying, for example, well, the C major arpeggio uses the notes C, E, and G. And then maybe they say, how do you play the notes individually in that, and say, how do you play the note C? And then you can say, well, this one is C. So how do you play the note C? You use your first finger, use your thumb. This is where it's located, and you can tell where the note C is located based on the 2 black keys versus the 3 black keys, if that's the way that we're doing this. All you have to do is find C. If the question is, okay, how do I play C? Well, how do you find C? This is how you find C. How do you play C? You use your thumb. How do you use your thumb? You put your thumb on that key and you push it down. Well, how do you do that? You move your hand toward the piano.
So this, at this point, would be the demonstration of it gets to the point where the description of breaking things down becomes absurd.
You don't have the ability to always say how. If you genuinely don't know how to do something, it's worth asking. Because the answer ought to be provided by someone who's interested in educating.
Mhm.
You can't blame someone for not knowing how to do something right away. You just have to know what level of detail you need to go to.
Mhm.
And if someone wants to keep saying how, they're going to find themselves looking like a fool.
Mhm. Because there is a threshold of absurdity that is crossed.
Correct.
But the key point when it comes to this idea of tangible, this property, this adjective of tangible, is that the specification has the capacity, has the ability to cross this threshold of absurdity. It is possible. And so therefore, perhaps we can say that the definition of tangible is that which can have too much detail provided.
Too much relevant detail.
Too much
Because
relevant detail.
these details combine into the actions themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So too much detail, I just want to make sure that that's differentiated from having too much detail because you're bringing things in that are irrelevant details.
Mm-hmm.
That would also be too much detail, but that's not what we're talking about.
Right.
It's the ability to subdivide the actions of something to the point where you know exactly what to do next. And if you don't know exactly what to do next, then you can continue to subdivide it until it's something that you know how to do.
Mm-hmm. So let's kind of put this spin on this. We're kind of now dancing away a little bit from the original question of trying to get around meta, but I'm envisioning this like a slingshot where we're going to come all the way over to tangibility, and that's going to fling us into the question of meta.
It is part of the definition of meta because you can define terms by addressing their opposites.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're doing.
Fair. So I do want to put this little ditty on it. With tangible thusly defined as that which can have too much relevant detail provided because it's absurd. Why is that a death knell? Why is that so detrimental to statements that lack this property? That is to say, statements that are intangible. So, for example, one of the things that you and I have very naturally fallen into a habit of over these years, we've encountered a wide variety of claims from a wide variety of individuals on a wide variety of different subjects and questions, and they make their claims, well, I think A, well, I think B, or, I think C. And you and I are very readily able to identify whatever these claims are. So that's intangible. What comes from that is that which is intangible can be dismissed.
Well,
is this true? If it's indeed true, why is it so? Because I have a little bit of a very strange commentary that can be provided on this, but let's just grant for the time being that when you have a proclamation, when you have a proposition that is intangible, why is that grounds to dismiss the claim?
Because educators can expect their students to do something tangible.
Is tangibility only applicable in the realm of education?
Well, I'm using the word educator loosely. That's not to address the education industry, but to describe someone teaching someone something, which could be in the education industry.
Could not be.
It could very well be not in the education industry because you're learning something from a friend or parent or someone.
Mm-hmm. About a particular topic.
Sure. Particular topic, particular skill, what have you. So the reason why I would say that is because what that allows for is it allows for the person who's trying to understand the ability to say, if this is not granted to me, and it's not my responsibility to provide all of these subdivisions if I can't, so you can do the best you can. You can try to subdivide it, which is what we do. And sometimes something is not tangible and then it becomes tangible. But the things that we discard are the things that have no way to become what I would say is grounded.
So let's do it this way. This actually might be a good segue into the tangential commentary that I have on this.
I just want to say one more thing. Yeah. You can't expect someone to do something intangible. So in order for something to be tangible, there's always an answer to the question how. The moment that the question how is presented, and the answer is, I don't know and I don't care to find out, that's when these claims get dismissed.
Elaborate on that.
Why would you try to give someone advice to do something that they don't know how to do. It's not helpful. It's impossible for them to actually implement it. You can't expect someone to do something that they don't know how to do.
And that you don't know how to do either. And so maybe this is a good point to sort of interject my tangential commentary on this, because there is a distinction to be made between a claim, a proposition, a statement that can be tangible, but just does not have the relevant level of detail provided to it.
Okay.
So the idea being like, you have a question, and the answer is whatever the answer may be. And then the person listening to this says, that's not tangible. There's no way to specify the relevant level of detail of how to do this. And then the comeback to that would be, I cannot provide the level of relevant detail. I do not have the level of relevant detail. All I know is that the answer is here. This is the answer. How it breaks down to the level of tangibility required is not a fault of the claim. That is a fault on myself. Then it seems to me that that's a situation where there's no harm, no foul. Which is basically to say that there is a distinction to be made between a statement that, this is going to get really, really amorphous, has the capacity to be made tangible, but just has not been made tangible yet, versus this other category of statements that are inherently intangible. It's just nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea being that if you dismiss both of these things, then you are kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Okay.
So when we talk about a lack of tangibility, that which is intangible, it seems to be that we have to speak very specifically about those claims that can never be made tangible, no matter how deeply you dig into them.
Well, that's something that I was going to say, is that they never become tangible.
Mm-hmm. And so for the time being, let's exclude this other category of claims and statements that can be made tangible, but whether the person proclaiming them does not have the personal ability to be able to make them tangible on their own. That's an idea that I'm sure we will revisit in later episodes. Let's just focus over here on these claims that are inherently intangible.
Well, all right. And we might even be able to address a solution to that problem by saying we can regard the intangible claims as something that cannot be implemented directly. At the point where they can be implemented directly, then great. That doesn't mean that more information won't provide the ability for these things to actually be useful. But so long as that information isn't provided, or so long as either someone else
or the information is not there.
Well, right.
Particularly in the context of what we're talking about, what ultimately shakes out to be nonsense.
So the information needs to come from somewhere. It's either the person who's making the claim, or I can even take responsibility myself for putting in my best effort for this information and trying to figure out what it actually means and how to actually use it and how to embody this information. But so long as that information isn't provided either directly to me by someone else or by me so that I can use this information, I cannot use that information. If that information is available eventually, then great. But until it is available, it's going to be in the other category. It's going to be right next to the other category of things that I cannot use.
So the category should not be labeled that which ought to be discredited, that which ought to be disregarded. It ought to be labeled as that which cannot be used. And sometimes things can emerge from that category and go into can be used category.
That which I cannot embody. That which is impossible to embody.
Or to implement.
Yeah, same thing. So something can come out of that category, but there exists a subcategory of things that will never come out of that category. The information cannot be provided because, like I was referring to earlier, inherent within that statement is the inability to answer all of my how questions. I cannot answer these questions for myself. It doesn't make sense to me how I just believe in myself. If I ask someone else, how do you do that? They will look at me and say, well, it's inherently obvious how you do that. You just go do it away from me when I'm not in the room doing something. There's never detail provided. Never. And I can't just sit in the room and say, believe in myself, believe in myself, believe in myself, and have anything of value come out. It's a consequence of that. Because that's supposed to be a cause, not a consequence. So you can't reverse causes and consequences, because if you reverse causes and consequences, then you don't get the consequences that you need, because you don't have the causes for the consequences that you want.
Right.
But this leads into a different description that I had. So did you have something else?
No.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So in the way of tangibility as well, I wanted to elaborate on the upward direction, which looks more like a pyramid, where on the ground, there are several individual actions over time. And those individual actions all have reasons.
Okay.
There's a reason for why you're doing these things. And that pyramid can subdivide to an absurd level of subdivisions. But from that absurd level of subdivisions gathers enough reasons to do things, enough answers to the question of why are you doing that, so that you can do this next thing in the sequence.
For the sake of abundant clarity, could you just drop a simple example into the structure of what you're describing as the pyramid to be able to illustrate what it is that this is seeking to encapsulate, to clarify, to describe? You use the term individual actions. So when you say individual actions, I can think of anything ranging from brushing my teeth to starting my own business or going on vacation to Tahiti. I mean, it's a wide variety of things. And so for the sake of clarity, if you could please just drop something in there and see what is this process that you are describing with this allegory of a pyramid structure. So like, why do I brush my teeth? All right, well, I brush my teeth so that my teeth don't rot and fall out. I don't want to have raging halitosis. Versus why it is that I would want to start my own business, or why is it that I would want to go to vacation in Tahiti, or why is it that I would want to get married, or why is it that, I mean, there's this wide spectrum of activities all the way from like scratching my chin to...
Sure, but that's the level of absurd detail that I'm talking about. There's a different range of answers to the question why. So why you would brush your teeth, if you want to say that you're going to brush your teeth, for example, so that your teeth don't fall out, well, you can keep asking the question why, like I was asking the question how, with regards to the piano example. So why would you brush your teeth, for example, if you're going to say so that your teeth don't fall out? Well, why don't you want your teeth to fall out? Well, you need to eat something, and you don't want to look socially like someone with no teeth. Well, why do you want to eat something? So there's a couple things there, right? So why do you want to eat something? Well, so that you have the energy to do meaningful work, for example. And why do you not want to socially look like someone with no teeth? So that you can have friends that can help you with your meaningful work and not want to run away from your toothless self.
Visage.
Whatever. I mean, the answers to the question why, as they're applied to specific things, will accumulate into combinations of actions. So if you're going to look at something like why are you going on a vacation to Tahiti, you're already granting that you're able to actually subdivide that into its proper steps. So that question...
So going down would be towards the direction of that which is tangible.
Correct.
How do you go to Tahiti?
How do you go on vacation to Tahiti?
Well, you buy the plane ticket. How do you get the money to buy the plane ticket? You have to do blah, 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 blah.
Well, there's that, but there's also the sequence of steps subdivided specifically under Tahiti. So you need to select the date. You need to buy the tickets. You need to pack your bags. You need to make sure that someone's going to take care of the dogs. You need to do this big list of things to prepare yourself for this event. And all of those things can be subdivided at a level of absurdity. But they accumulate into, well, why are you packing your bags? Why are you finding someone to take care of the dogs? The answer to all of those questions is the same thing, to go on a vacation to Tahiti, which is why I have the image of a pyramid.
I see. So then when you ask the question, why are you going on a vacation to Tahiti, then that's when you leave that matrix. That's when you leave that particular set and you go into a higher set.
Right. Well, everything's always in a sequence. It's always in a linear sequence because us mortals work in linear time at the moment. So the sequence of things that you can do to interact with the world are linear. That linear sequence accumulates into the reasons for why you would do something. Sometimes you have something that you want to do because there's a reason for it to be in a sequence, but it's not clear how it subdivides into something that you can actually implement, something that you can do. So there's a lot of value in being able to find the way to subdivide and make something tangible. Because if it's a good idea to go on vacation to Tahiti, because Tahiti is in the sequence of events, which allows you to, for example, schedule vacation time so that you can come back refreshed and continue to work efficiently, that's in the context and that's in the sequence of, for example, the productivity of that year at work. So you can continue to ask these questions for why you're doing all of these things. And as you continue to ask the questions for why you're doing all of these things, there's a point where the answers to these questions become more abstract. Because what you're doing is you're embodying actions that operate under an abstraction. Because you have an abstraction, and then that subdivides into how that actually would work. And then that subdivides to the level of something that you would actually do.
Mm-hmm. So where does that leave us?
Well, that leads us to a situation where if you can't actually bring a reason to the point where it's something that you can implement, then...
Because its detail can be provided to the level of absurdity. That's what you're talking about, because it can be implemented.
Well, it cannot. So something that cannot be implemented.
Oh, right. But the condition of can be implemented is describing this level of too much relevant detail.
Correct. You don't know what to do next.
Mm-hmm.
Because you have to do something. When you move around those tectonic plates at the top of the pyramid, everything underneath it moves with it, and it affects your next decision. So understanding the meta is understanding the larger pieces at work and what connections need to be made where. What that provides is a distinction between the question of how do you take this thing, and is it possible to take this thing and generate an example, to generate some kind of a permutation where someone can do this thing, or where I can do this thing? Or what does that mean when I have the example of whatever is right in front of me that I'm trying to acknowledge under this structure of understanding? Or to say, well, what's the general principle that this is supposed to be operating under? And if this is the general principle that this is supposed to be operating under, or the first principle that this is supposed to be operating under, then how does that principle become relevant to the point where my ability to enact, embody, and use that principle is obvious to me? Because it's really nice to know.
Well, is obvious to you, and then at that point can be made obvious to any third party.
Well, sure, because the question of why you're doing this actually has an answer. What are you doing and why? So the question, what are you doing, can subdivide into how are you doing what you're doing and why are you doing what you're doing?
Or why you are even making the statements that you are making.
Well, sure, because if you understand the meta, then you understand the motivations. You understand the other things that are moving with that meta, everything that's attached to it, which allows you to predict the next thing that moves.
It gives you a far greater degree of calculation power because you don't have to keep track of all of these particulars. You keep track of one first principle or just a couple of core principles. And so by being able to keep track of one explicitly stated core principle that operates as the first principle, the tectonic plate upon which all these other things rest, then all you just need to do is calculate how that tectonic plate moves, and then everything else renders from that.
It's a vital process for understanding how the world works and to be able to predict what people are doing, which is also nice to be able to do, if you can.
Right.
And it also gives you the detail and the understanding to make sometimes very bold decisions.
Or very bold statements, for that matter.
Sure. Because if it operates under the meta, then you already know, you've already accounted for the possibilities of what can happen as a result.
Okay. So at this point, there are two things that I want to make sure that we get to. One thing that I want to make sure that we get to is that we account for our shorthand of thumb up, thumb down, and how thumb up, thumb down fits into this pyramid-like infrastructure that you're describing of how why and how tie together.
Mm-hmm.
Of how any wide array of individualized actions or statements can be bound and tied together. The second thing that I want to do is I want to go through a very, I'm going to use the term now, thumb down example.
Okay.
Once we're through acknowledging all of the thumb up procedures and structures I want to be able to provide the audience sort of a taste of here's a completely randomized question or topic that plagues whatever group of individuals. And once you have the power of thumb up, thumb down, as it is tied to this question of tangibility and meta, this is what happens.
Mm-hmm.
This suddenly becomes the entire range of options once these tools are available to you. So I just want to make sure that we don't leave this without being able to commit in the same way that we were able to commit to a articulated definition of the property of tangible. I want to be able to commit to an articulated definition of meta, and then we can drop all the puzzle pieces in place.
Well, the best way to demonstrate the tangibility of a description is to give an example. So, great. I don't have a problem with that. I think also we've basically described the difference between thumb up and thumb down, but I'm going to elaborate a little bit. So thumb up and thumb down are...
And this actually has a funny story. Go ahead and do your elaboration, and I'll kind of fill in the audience on the story.
Sure. So essentially, when we are having a discussion and it's not clear whether this discussion is about how or this discussion is about why, it's not clear whether this discussion is about the meta or it's about the details at hand, then there's a hand signal that we started implementing where this is a question for the larger structure at work, which would be thumb up. So thumb up would be meta. And then thumb down would be the details, the tangibility of what it is that I have to do now, what it is that I have in front of me at the moment.
The question of the particulars.
Yes. As they are specifically attributed to whoever it is, either one of us at that point. So if I am asking a thumb up question, I'm asking abstractly, what are the major principles at work here and how can I understand the larger pieces that are moving? And if I ask a thumb down question, then I'm asking about the details of what I have to deal with and how I'm supposed to proceed. So that basically already distinguishes the thumb up, thumb down term. It's just something that we used because we needed a binary distinction between these two directions.
Right. And this is where the funny story comes in, because when you and I sort of started getting into a lot of these sorts of discussions.
Well, we confused each other a lot.
Very much so. And I will say for the record that it was not until we sort of came up with this silly hand signal convention that our own discussions started becoming a lot smoother. Because I definitely recall years ago when we started a lot of these discussions in our friendship, you would make these, what I could only describe to be outlandish claims. And eventually I would figure out that you were making these claims very abstractly, in a very elevated abstract sense. But what was going on was that you would switch between these two ranges of the abstract to the concrete very quickly. And I felt like I was experiencing this kind of whiplash. Okay, so 1 minute he was talking about the abstract tectonic first principles without directly commentating on what the proximal questions were right in front of your face to the proximal questions, while being able to suspend question of how the thumb up meta tectonic first principles questions and statements connected to the thumb down realm. And so that's when I said, I can keep up with you, that's fine, but can you give me a signal of some kind? Like when a skier is going down the slope, he at least has flags to let him know to bank right or whatever. That's sort of the story of where the hand signals came in, and then it just became instantiated as a term to refer to this process of acknowledging these two realms, the tectonic first principles, that which stands behind the surface level questions, and then the actual surface level questions in particulars.
Sure, and I believe my response at the time, if I remember rightly, was, if you want to, I suppose that would be something we can try if it would be helpful. It wasn't something I really understood, but then...
Boy, was it helpful.
It became very helpful because it turned into a way to clarify the information that I was either elaborating upon, referencing, or trying to understand. It gave a direction that it's supposed to go.
Because when armed with these tools, the generic individual will come upon situations fairly frequently where the generic individual needs to be able to temporarily suspend the question of how these two poles connect to each other. They will eventually need to connect to each other, but if you don't necessarily know how from the beginning, that doesn't mean there's nothing left to do. That doesn't mean that you can't proceed. That doesn't mean there's nothing left to talk about or nothing left to investigate. You can temporarily untether these two things, play in each one of these realms, generating alternatives for each, trying to get your bearings on each one of these things independently, and then you can come back and try to see how these things tie together, if they tie together at all.
And yeah, the thumb up, thumb down distinction was quite arbitrary at the time. We weren't even thinking about the convenient directions that they're pointing in order to guide the conversation in one direction or another direction, but it's convenient at this point to add the meaning of that onto the end of it.
So then, given that, how does this bring us closer to an articulatable definition of meta? Because we're not going to be able to get away from that.
Is this an example question?
No, similar to the way that we have the articulated definition of the term tangible, I want to make sure that we get our hands on an articulated definition of the term meta, and then we throw it into an example. How would we describe meta in the thumb up sense? And then once we got that, we can throw all manner of examples at it to demonstrate what the tools look like in action.
You're running into an obnoxious problem. You're trying to define something that creates definitions. So this is what I was talking about when I was saying the meta of meta. Because you just said thumb up, what's the definition of meta, which means what's the meta of meta.
Right.
And I would say that's a moo question.
I don't think meta is so abstract, is so fundamental that it qualifies into the first chapter of the Tao Te Ching, where it talks about the way that can be described is not the true way. I don't think meta is at that level. There are things that are at that level, but I don't think meta is.
Yeah. Maybe I can say that which the tangible actions construct. So it's built upon tangible actions.
How about this for a definition? Let me try throwing this out. Let me see what you think. Meta is that which connects any given set of particulars.
Okay.
And therefore, the reason why it is so important to have an understanding of meta is because to manipulate meta is to simultaneously manipulate all the particulars beneath it, or above it, or derived from it. It's a root system.
Yeah. That's why I don't know if I should be going in the direction of up for meta or down for meta, because there's a strong case to be made that both directions are defensible. The root system is very much consistent with the downward direction, the tectonic plates exist.
Well, all you have to do is take your pyramid that you were describing and turn it on its head. Take your pyramid and stick it upside down so the tip is pointing down. So you have this wide two-dimensional plane that metaphorically encapsulates the entirety of the world as this is available to the generic individual, but all those things all contract back to a single point of origin. It's very cosmologically sound in such a description.
Well, what I like about that which connects particulars is that that is not a difficult argument to make, to say that it's possible for particulars to be connected. And once you can grant the connection of particulars, you should be able to tangibly grant the connection of particulars, because absurd detail provides the connection where you combine the absurd details into that manifestation of a connection of particulars. And then you have different layers of those particulars, which is what allows you to have the meta of various subjects.
Any question, really, that could possibly be asked.
Right. Where you have the meta of the piano, and the meta of the arpeggio, and the meta of the note,
And then
the meta of playing the note.
Or you can even go up the meta of music.
Yeah, but that's the Y
Right.
direction. That's the meta of music, exactly, if you're so bold. Because you better be right if you're going to talk about the meta of music, because then
You're going to affect a whole lot.
well, that's right, because all the particulars that are attached to that move with it.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be consistent with what I was describing. Sure.
So, tangible is a condition of that for which too much relevant detail can be provided because it's absurd. Meta is that which connects any given set of particulars. I like that.
I think we can settle on that for now.
So now at this point, for our closing act, I want to very purposefully give our audience at home a bit of a show, in the sense of I want to pick a random generic topic question, and I want to run this generic topic or question through this mechanism of thumb up, thumb down, meta, tangible, and I want to show this is the sort of fun you can have. This is what you can do once you have these tools. So is there anything off the top of the head you'd like to recommend to throw into the machine, if you will?
And I'm assuming you want to just use thumb up, thumb down like we regularly would?
I think so, because I think at this point now we can have a reasonable confidence in the fact that the audience at home listening to this rather abstract dialogue, an inquiry into these concepts, can now nevertheless follow this idea of thumb up and thumb down. Maybe not at this current time because we haven't provided the example, but this is a part of the reason why I am very adamant. I want to make sure that we provide at least one example, maybe a couple if we can do it, so we can show the audience this is what thumb up and thumb down looks like, and this is the reason why you use it and how you use it, particularly in the context of referencing meta, which we've defined, and tangibility, which we have also defined.
Mm-hmm.
So now that you have these things, you now need to see how it actually works from a front row seat perspective.
Right.
I think for us to use the term thumb up, thumb down as we would in any of our normal discussions, I think at this point would just be beneficial.
And for ultimate abundant clarity of absurd detail, to reiterate, meta is thumb up, tangibility is thumb down. You have no excuse to be lost with those distinctions.
I think we can assume the competency of our audience.
But there's an example of an absurd level of detail. Say it again when you don't actually need to.
Okay. So I'll give the floor to you first in terms of if there's anything off the top of your head you would like to recommend for sample material to rip through. I have a couple of recommendations that I could throw out.
I'm thinking, but if you have something already ready,
let me just put out what I have bouncing around in my head. They're basically really generic discussion points that are decades old by this point, like what I opened the episode with about the question of abortion, particularly as the abortion debate exists in the United States. There's also the question of civilian ownership of guns. People have been arguing about that for God knows how long. There's, this one was a huge hot button issue back in the Bush administration. The question of gay marriage as an example. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when that was a question that was left, particularly in the American context, to individual states. And then you had some states saying okay, and you had some states saying no. And these are rather dated examples, but I think that these sorts of dated examples are nevertheless valuable because it sort of puts into fresh perspective the way that these questions can be addressed and the way that generic individuals can rip through these ideas and questions by using these tools.
Well, for the sake of consistency, we can return to the example that you were referring to regarding the state's legitimacy in legislation for things that are moral. So, I mean, there are questions I can ask about that if you want to just return to.
And that's not to say that we have to declare what our actual positions on these questions are. It's more for demonstrative purposes of how do you actually query these things.
Well, we can try something. I don't have a lot to instantly contribute to, I want to talk about this in terms of the example for thumb up and thumb down distinctions. Returning to that subject just because you had it earlier would be sufficient, I suppose.
Sure. All right. So let's rip through that. So obviously the question of abortion, and already there are several directions that you can go with that because you have the question of whether or not abortion is morally justified. And then you also have the question of whether or not the state apparatus, government apparatus has a prerogative, has a responsibility, has any business getting involved in either its permission or its banning.
Well, let me ask you the follow-up to that question, which is, if you were to say, for example, that the state does not have legitimacy, so the state ought not be involved in the legislation for whether someone should or should not get an abortion, then what are the consequences of that as it pertains to both of the two sides as you originally set it up? Because you were talking about the original two sides of this argument, and then you said that the meta point, the thumb up point, needs to first and foremost address the role of the state.
Mm-hmm.
So, granted that one of the two directions for the role of the state is in place, such as the state ought not, because you're saying the state ought not ought.
Well, it depends on which position you take. And this actually might be a point where we might have to shift a little bit. I might even throw in an alternative example here just to demonstrate this point. Because you have, a thumb up question of what ought the role of the state to be. What responsibilities, what functions ought to be regulated to the state?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're dealing with this question thumb up, then it seems to be that you have something like, all right, well, there exists this category of things that the state ought to be involved with. And the question is whether or not abortion is one of those things. Mm-hmm. How does abortion enter into that category? Because presumably you might have a totalitarian who proclaims the category entitled things that the state ought not to be involved with is an empty category. Anything that can possibly be conceived of is a thing that the state ought to have a stake in, that the state ought to have a role in determining whatever. Sure, but thumb up, you're dealing with the existence of these two categories. It's just a question of what goes into the categories. Okay, so the state, then, if you proclaim that the state has no business controlling or getting involved with questions of that which is moral versus immoral, because then the question becomes whose morality? Then the other side to that would be saying that there has to be some base level acceptance of rules to play by, because if you do not have something as basic as, for example, the non-aggression principle, you cannot bring harm to anybody's person or property. Otherwise, you have no society to operate. Therefore, that is exactly the reason why things like theft, vandalism, murder, battery, these things the state has a very clear role in getting involved with, because if you have a society that proclaims it's the purge, like those really dumb purge movies, you can do whatever you want, murder's legal, do whatever you can get away with, you have no ability for society to interact. Okay, so therefore, a fetus is a person, therefore, killing a fetus is tantamount to murder, so therefore it doesn't matter that which is moral or immoral, it violates the thumb up base level of principles of procedure upon which an entire society can operate. Now, I want to use that tangentially because I want to kind of go to the side a little bit by bringing in a separate topic or a separate question to sort of rip through that really fits into this even more nicely. And that is the question of legalized sex work and prostitution. Because prostitution bumps up against the abortion question very similarly, because you once again have this question of that which is moral or immoral. The key distinction here is that in the case of legalized sex work and prostitution, you have free trade, provided that you are assuming there's no coercion going on. You have two individuals engaging in a voluntary trade, and there's no violation of the non-aggression principle. Okay, but it's still morally wrong. Therefore, the state has a prerogative of not allowing prostitution to exist. Okay, well, then that is to presume, thumb up, the state, once again, has a role in legislating that which is moral.
Well, one way that might help to bring an example out of this as well is to say, if you're going to claim, thumb up, that the state ought to be involved with legislating all morality for its citizens, you get some very problematic thumb down consequences for that.
Elaborate. Because the question of the state ought to be legislating morality is very much a thumb up claim. Okay, fine. It's very much thumb up. Why should the state do that or not do that? But if you commit to the why, then, like you said, you bring the thumb down. What happens as a result?
Well, you're introducing a lot of terms that aren't defined here. I don't know if I want to bring the thumb up on morality. It's one direction we could go, what morality means. But the direction that I was thinking was if you give the state, in this case, too much power over something that they ought not have power over, if you're going to say that they ought not have power over morality because morality, for example, is not something that's obeyed, but it's something that's chosen, then you're going to find yourself in a situation where the state is doing something that they really shouldn't be doing. So a thumb down example of that is what happens when the state enforces abortion.
Mm-hmm.
That would be a thumb down example. And no state is so unwilling and benevolent that that's never happened.
Cough.
What happens when you have Minority Report problems of the state stopping people before they do things that they know that they're going to do that are bad in the future? What happens when the state doesn't do something moral? You can bring the thumb down on anything that's not moral. Once there's a contradiction, if there's no authority above the state to correct them, then they're going to get away with it. So you don't give them that authority so that they don't cause terrible things to happen. I don't quite know exactly where to take this question, but maybe that's just a matter of trying to prepare for examples.
Right. And the beauty of this toolkit is that they all compound on each other. And so certainly as we go through the other questions of the other episodes, we will definitely be using thumb up and thumb down a lot more.
Well, sure. And I mean, you have to deal with precedent. So it's the same idea as a lot of times someone will say that they can't let one person in the group get away with something because then everyone's going to do it. And if everyone does what they're doing, then nothing works anymore. So you can't let one person not go to the meeting because then other people are going to figure out that they can get away with not going to the meeting and then no one goes to the meeting.
How does
So thumb up, you can't allow people to not go to the meeting.
I see what you did there. Right. So thumb down, it's completely irrelevant whether or not this person goes to a company meeting, but thumb up, if you allow the generic individual to not go to a meeting, then everyone doesn't go to a meeting. It's the meta of a lot of classroom management as well.
Or just any meeting, really.
Yeah. Because what happens is, particularly between thumb up and thumb down, is that when you go thumb up, the statement or whatever is inherently universalized. Versus the thumb down, like, oh, well, thumb down, I mean, it's not a problem.
One person is sick, that doesn't mean that the meeting's canceled.
Right. I like what you did there. It's really good. So I got everything on my list. Is there anything you would like to contribute? Or any stone that you feel was insufficiently investigated? Anything you'd like to return to?
That's basically everything. I have a little note here about acknowledging function, generating the solutions to these problems, and then if you have tangible alternatives that are consistent with the meta, there's still a process required to test that material to make sure that it actually works. But if you did it right, then it's going to work. But if you did it wrong, then you're going to know why, and then you're going to be able to apply that to the meta so that you know what it is that
that just becomes a process of investigation.
Well, sure, but that's just another layer on top of being able to implement these ideas. And the expectation to be able to implement the ideas and have them actually affect something that you're doing. So, got to everything?
I think that's pretty much everything for this first round. Any closing words?
Yeah. You have to be really careful with the word meta and give it the weight that it deserves, because it can go into the direction of why that's more absurd that you can manage. It's a term that can be used accurately to refer to something smaller, but it's not only to be used trivially. The answers to the question, what are you doing and why, are vital to a decision-making process. That much certainly should be obvious, but what's less obvious is the absolute value and power in terms of competency that results from dividing these two directions of organizing ideas so that you can understand why you're doing something, the meaning of what it is that you're pursuing, but also how to do it in such a way where you actually do, and it actually matters, and it actually works. People try to give really terrible advice because they don't even know the answer to the question how. The claims need to be taken seriously in the sense of understanding whether that tangibility can be brought down to sufficient and absurd detail. And it's important to understand that if someone says something and there's no way to actually do it and they don't care to actually teach you, it's not worth considering. There are other motivations for them to tell you this, and you can bring the thumb up on why someone would be making an intangible statement and what it is that they're trying to get you to do. And if you can figure out the reason for why they are telling you this intangible thing, because it's not to actually help you, because if it was to help you, then they'd be able to help you understand how to do it. It reveals something about the character of the person that you're having a discussion with, and whether they are interested in helping you or interested in getting you to do something that you otherwise wouldn't do. And I reiterate, it's proper for an individual to expect themselves to know at all times what they're doing and why. That answer to that question should never be unclear. And it doesn't matter what level of detail and what level of analysis you're looking at, the answer to that question should be clear. If you don't know the answer to that question, and the next thing that you figure out is the answer to that question, so be it. That's fine. That's consistent. But rather than having terrible platitudes that don't affect the ordering of chaos, so there's nothing to actually do about it, and instead of having a bunch of things that you're doing, but you don't really know why you're doing them, you're just doing them, those are both roads to intense confusion, to put it lightly. Hell is on the other side of that. That can't be perpetuated. The meta and the tangibility must be connected and they must work in practice. That would be the tangibility. But it has to inform your decisions in such a way where it actually makes things better, or else there's no reason to do it. So, understanding the range of these two directions, the scope that you're addressing, and the measurable distance of those layers is scalable. You can do that for something small. I like the smaller example in this case of the meeting, going to the meeting. But like I was saying earlier, you can scale that into the notes versus the phrase versus the piece versus the idea of music itself. And even the idea of music itself fits into a higher level of meta. You can keep going, which is one of the reasons why it's so difficult to say, well, what's above the meta? Well, the meta just keeps going. It keeps going until it's absurd for you to continue to follow it. But that's the spectrum and that's the realm of your mortality. There are things that you're not able to consider on both sides. You're not able to consider the absurd details, and you're not able to consider the scaled version of what's connecting these particulars. But that's enough. And it's enough because when these things are linked properly, the chaos becomes sufficiently ordered that you know what you're doing, and what you're doing is what you ought to be doing. What you're doing is what you should be doing. It's a means to understanding one way to helpfully make sense of the world. And helpfully making sense of the world is important for anyone with a brain, which is anyone that cares about what I'm saying.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been The Garage. Until next time, Vido Rigo Sperante. Keep breathing, everyone.